Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
You're the only child who didn't break my heart, my mother said to Lindsay with a soft, radiant smile that could have passed for maternal warmth if it didn't burn like acid in my chest. The words floated across the dining room table, cushioned by the clink of silverware and the low murmur of Thanksgiving small talk. But they hit me like a punch to the gut. That room, bathed in warm yellow light, filled with the smell of roasted turkey and pie and everything that was supposed to feel like home, suddenly felt suffocating. My heart didn't drop. It hardened. Not from shock. I wasn't shocked. Not after all these years. But there was something about hearing it said so plainly, so shamelessly, in front of everyone, that cracked the surface of my silence. I placed my fork down carefully, not abruptly, because even now, I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. The worst part wasn't even that she said it. It was the way she said it, with that half laugh like she was sharing some innocent truth, like it was a compliment wrapped in a confession, as if I'd been waiting my whole life to finally hear it spoken out loud. And now that I had, I was supposed to nod and accept it, maybe even feel grateful for the closure. I looked around the table. My dad didn't flinch. He just took a slow sip of his wine, eyes fixed on the glass like it was more interesting than the tension slicing through the air. My brother-in-law chuckled awkwardly, said something dumb about how Lindsay had always been the family angel. The kids were on their phones. Nobody seemed to notice that I had stopped chewing, that I hadn't spoken in minutes. So I stood up, not rushed, not dramatic, just steady, deliberate. I reached into my purse, the small black leather one I always brought to these dinners, and pulled out a white envelope. It wasn't sealed. It didn't have to be. The weight of what was inside was enough. I walked over to her, leaned in just close enough for her to hear me, and said in a voice calm as still water, "Read this before you finish that sentence." I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. I placed the envelope on the table, right next to her wine glass, and sat back down. The table had gone quiet, but not because anyone expected a scene. They'd all gotten used to my silences. They just didn't know that, for once, I wasn't going to swallow it. I watched as her hand hovered over the envelope, fingers trembling slightly, whether from age or guilt or just fear of the unknown, I couldn't tell. But her expression changed, just slightly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. Something shifted. Maybe she knew what it was, maybe not. I could feel Lindsay staring at me, confused, defensive already, like she knew this wasn't about her, and yet everything always somehow circled back to her. She tilted her head like she wanted to ask what was going on, but she didn't. Of course she didn't. Why would she need to? She had the crown. I was just the audience. Let me stop right here and ask you something. Have you ever spent your whole life waiting for someone to love you the way they loved somebody else? Not hate you, not even dislike you, just fail to see you. Like your wallpaper in your own story. If you've ever felt like that, like you were only tolerated while someone else was celebrated, then you already know why I did what I did. And you probably already know that what's in that envelope isn't just paper, it's years. It's everything I never said because I thought saying it wouldn't matter. And now it was going to matter more than anything. People always talk about breaking points like they're these big explosions, screaming matches, plates thrown, doors slammed. But mine wasn't like that. Mine came quiet. It came in the form of a sentence that sounded like love, dressed up like praise, but aimed like a knife. It came after a lifetime of playing nice, of shrugging off the slights, of pretending I didn't notice how my mother's voice always lifted an octave higher when she spoke to Lindsay, how her hugs lasted a little longer, how her disappointments were always somehow reserved just for me. She'd say things like, "You've always been so independent, Rachel." And I used to take that as a compliment, until I realized it was just code for, "I don't worry about you because I don't feel close to you." Or maybe it was, "I don't expect anything from you because I don't see you the way I see her." You start to learn that some wounds don't bleed. They just quietly fester. I'd lived my entire adult life believing that the best revenge was success, that all I had to do was build a stable life, stay out of trouble, keep my head down, and eventually she'd come around. Eventually, she'd say the words I needed to hear, but she never did. And that night, when she smiled at Lindsay and said that Lindsay was the only one who hadn't broken her heart, I finally understood that I could spend another 20 years being the good daughter, and it wouldn't make a damn bit of difference. Because the truth was, I never had a chance. I was the shadow standing next to her son. So I stopped trying to win a game that was rigged from the start. I made my own game. One where I didn't need her validation. One where I finally got to speak first. Or last. She hadn't even opened the envelope yet, but I could see her fingers twitching, her eyes darting between it and me. And I smiled, not cruelly, not smugly, just enough to let her know this wasn't random. This wasn't some emotional outburst. This was planned, measured, long time coming. And as I sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching her hesitate, I knew one thing for certain. She thought I was about to break her heart. But I wasn't, not yet. People like to say that all children are loved equally, that every parent does the best they can with what they have, and that if you dig deep enough into anyone's past, you'll find wounds that justify their choices. But let me tell you something with absolute clarity. Those people have never sat in the same room with their own mother while she forgot, in front of others, that they were even part of the story. From the time I was old enough to read between the lines of tone and timing, I knew my place in the hierarchy of affection, and I knew it wasn't at the top or even the middle. It was in the wings, somewhere just off stage, where the light never quite reached and the applause was always meant for someone else. I don't think I was born bitter, and I don't think my sister Lindsay came out holding a golden crown, but I do believe that, from a very young age, I noticed the difference in how our mother, Diana, looked at us. Not just looked, but really saw. Lindsay's wins, no matter how small, were cause for celebration, displayed like trophies on the mental shelves of every family memory. While mine, though often harder earned and sometimes more significant, were acknowledged with a polite nod, if that. When I brought home a perfect report card, the response was a distracted, "Well, you've always been good at school," as if that excellence was a personality quirk, rather than something I worked for. But when Lindsay managed to pass a test she hadn't studied for, it was met with praise and a retelling of how resilient she was, how she pulled it together despite the odds, as though mediocrity wrapped in charm was somehow more impressive than effort laced with discipline. The first time I remember truly understanding that I was the invisible child, I must have been about 10 years old. It was my birthday, not a major milestone, just one of those in-between years. But I had spent the entire week looking forward to it, convinced that this time, maybe this time, things would be different. I didn't expect a party like the ones Lindsay got, with themed decorations, professional cakes, and a living room full of neighborhood kids. I didn't even want that. I just wanted a cake that someone else baked, a card that wasn't signed at the last minute, and a moment, just one, where it felt like I was the center of something good. But when the day came, the celebration was small, quiet, and almost forgettable. There was a store-bought cupcake with a candle, and a gift that still had the clearance sticker on it. And when I asked about the cake, my mother said, "You don't even like sweets that much, do you?" As if that justified not trying. The part that stung the most wasn't the lack of effort. It was the look on her face when she said it, like she believed it, like she'd convinced herself that I never really needed anything from her. And that was enough of an excuse to give me less. Lindsay, on the other hand, was magnetic in a way I never learned to be. She was the kind of child people naturally paid attention to, loud in the right ways, dramatic but endearing, messy in a way that made you want to clean up after her. Our mother adored her chaos, celebrated it, made room for it, while my orderliness, my carefulness, was treated like emotional distance. I wasn't cold, I was cautious. But to a woman like Diana, who mistook noise for love and recklessness for freedom, my quietness was not something she understood, and people don't often love what they don't understand. Over the years, the imbalance became less about what was done and more about what was withheld. It was in the unspoken things. The lack of eye contact, the forgotten stories, the way she would talk about my girls to her friends and only mention Lindsay's achievements, as if I was a technicality, a footnote in someone else's narrative. She didn't hate me. That would have required too much energy. She just dismissed me, like an afterthought. I learned to survive by fading. I became the helper, the fixer, the one who didn't ask for much because I learned early that asking only led to disappointment. If I needed new shoes, I waited until mine were nearly unwearable. If I was sick, I kept it to myself unless I couldn't stand up. I became good at not needing because I understood that the economy of love in our household ran on attention, and Lindsay had already maxed out the supply. Looking back, I don't even blame my sister, not entirely. She was just playing the role that was handed to her. She basked in the light she was given, and who could blame her? But she also knew. That's the part people never talk about. She knew I was being shortchanged. She saw it in real time and said nothing. Maybe because it felt good to be chosen, maybe because she didn't want to risk the spotlight, or maybe because somewhere deep down she believed she deserved it more. But I remember everything. Every holiday where my gifts were an afterthought, every family dinner where my contributions were ignored, every photograph where I was shoved to the side. I remember how my mother cried at Lindsay's graduation and barely looked up from her phone at mine. I remember the time I stayed up all night helping her prepare for a work presentation and got a hurried thanks, while Lindsay once brought her coffee and got a social media post about how thoughtful she was. Over time, I stopped hoping for her attention and started documenting the gap, not just in memory, but in practice. I began keeping a journal, not of feelings, but of facts, events, statements, dates. It wasn't revenge, not at first. It was survival, proof that I hadn't imagined it, that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't just some bitter middle child making up stories. That journal eventually became something else, a blueprint, a plan. But at the time, it was just my way of not letting the truth slip through the cracks of emotional gaslighting. So when my mother sat at that Thanksgiving table, surrounded by people who still thought she was the glue of our family, and said to Lindsay that she was the only child who hadn't broken her heart, I didn't hear it as a sudden betrayal. I heard it as the final proof in a case I had been building for over 2 decades. And when I handed her that envelope, I knew exactly what it meant. I knew that, for the first time, she would have to read a truth she could no longer ignore. And the truth was simple. I never broke her heart. She just never gave me the chance. They say there's always that one moment, that one memory that splits a life into before and after. And while most people imagine it as a car accident, a diagnosis, or some great tragedy that the world acknowledges with flowers or casseroles or collective sympathy, mine came wrapped in teenage silence and the scent of barbecue smoke, on a summer night that should have just been another page in the family scrapbook, but ended up rewriting everything I thought I understood about loyalty, love, and how far betrayal could reach when it was hand-delivered by someone you were raised to trust without question. I was 16 that year, and for the first time, I'd felt like maybe I had something of my own, something untouched by Lindsay's shadow, something that belonged to me, not because I fought for it, but because it simply chose me back. And that something, or rather someone, was Caleb Monroe. He wasn't flashy or loud or anything particularly remarkable on the surface, but he looked at me like I mattered, like I was visible, and after years of feeling like furniture in my own home, that look meant more than I ever dared admit. We met in chemistry class, and it started with shared glances over lab burners and side comments that made us laugh when we weren't supposed to. Before long, he was walking me to class, waiting outside for me after practice, and calling late at night just to hear me talk about things no one else ever asked me about. For once, I wasn't just someone's sister or someone's daughter. I was Rachel, and I was wanted. I didn't tell anyone about him at first, not because I was hiding him, but because I wanted something that felt like it belonged only to me. And in our family, secrets were currency, but privacy was rare, and anything you loved too loudly got picked apart until it bled. So I held on to it. our little secret bubble where I could be something other than the afterthought. And for a few months, it felt like peace. Until Lindsay noticed. It started small. She'd make comments when I smiled at my phone, casually asking who I was texting with that Rachel never giggles smirk she'd perfected by middle school. Then she started showing up where she hadn't been invited, lingering in doorways, eavesdropping during calls, making too much eye contact whenever Caleb was around. And then, one night in July, it happened. It was a family barbecue, one of those weekend rituals where everyone pretended to enjoy each other's company for the sake of tradition. The air was thick with the scent of grilled meat and cheap cologne, and I'd been inside helping my dad fix something with the stereo when I realized Caleb wasn't by the fire pit anymore. I looked around casually, not panicked, not suspicious, just expecting to find him chatting with someone, maybe grabbing a drink. But something didn't sit right. The way Lindsay had been watching him earlier, the way she'd laughed a little too hard at his jokes, the way she'd brushed her hair behind her ear, the way she always did when she was performing attention. I stepped into the garage to grab something from the extra fridge, and that's when I saw them. They didn't see me at first. I had the advantage of the half-closed door and the muffling hum of the generator. They were standing too close. Lindsay was laughing, her head tilted back, hand grazing his chest. And then, without hesitation, she kissed him. Just like that. Bold, intentional, and without shame. And the worst part wasn't even the kiss. It was that he didn't pull away. My first instinct wasn't to scream. It was to disappear. I backed away quietly. My stomach twisted into something I'd never felt before. A combination of nausea, betrayal, and something colder, something that didn't feel like pain, but like the beginning of a new kind of strength. I didn't cry. I didn't run to my mom. I didn't make a scene. I went upstairs, closed my door, and sat on my bed for over an hour, staring at the ceiling and letting the silence teach me something I hadn't known before. Love isn't always taken from you violently. Sometimes it's peeled away while you watch, and no one around you even notices that you're bleeding. Later that night, I confronted Caleb. He stammered, tried to lie, then admitted it had just happened, said he was confused, that Lindsay had been coming on strong, and he didn't know how to shut it down without making things weird. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just said, "You don't get to act confused when you kissed her back," and walked away. I never saw him again after that, but it wasn't about him anymore. What Lindsay did wasn't just about a boy. It was about power. She knew he mattered to me, and that alone made him valuable in her game. And my mother? When I finally told her, months later, her response was even worse than the silence. She said, "You're young. There will be others. Don't hold it against your sister. She probably didn't even realize how you felt." As if my feelings were optional, as if they were secondary to Lindsay's reputation, as if I had overreacted by thinking I deserved to be defended. That was the night something inside me shifted permanently. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, I didn't break things. I broke myself, quietly, methodically, and with intention. I stopped trying to be the better person. I stopped giving people the benefit of the doubt. I started watching more closely, listening more carefully, and most of all, I started remembering every single thing people assumed I'd forget. That was the beginning of the end, or maybe, more accurately, the beginning of the version of me that could survive this family without needing anything from them. I didn't hate Lindsay that night. I understood her for the first time. I saw that she wasn't just my sister, she was my rival in a game I never agreed to play. And my mother, she wasn't just emotionally unavailable, she was complicit. So no, I didn't scream, I didn't throw punches, I just stopped believing in the idea that goodness earned love. And I started collecting the pieces of their lies, one betrayal at a time, until I had enough to build my own truth. And that truth would live in an envelope, waiting for the day I finally stopped pretending that silence was noble. There's something uniquely exhausting about growing up in someone's shadow. Not because the light never touches you, but because you're constantly reminded it wasn't meant to. And even when you manage to shine on your own, the people who should be clapping are too busy looking past you, distracted by the golden child whose failures are forgiven before they've even been acknowledged. After that night in the garage, after the kiss and the silence and the final confirmation that I had been playing a game, I was never meant to win. I didn't spiral, I sharpened. I realized that my greatest mistake up to that point hadn't been trusting Caleb, or even hoping for fairness from my mother, but in believing that if I just stayed kind, stayed useful, stayed invisible, one day someone would reward me for it. And so I stopped playing for applause. I started playing for control. The years that followed weren't glamorous or dramatic, but they were deliberate. I went off to college 2 states away, not because it was prestigious or impressive, but because it was far enough to finally breathe without the weight of their expectations pressing down on my shoulders. I didn't announce my major at dinner, didn't beg for anyone to visit, didn't pretend that I needed their approval. I got my degree in finance with honors, something that would have warranted banners and cake if it had been Lindsay, and received a text from my mom that said, "Congrats, I knew you'd do well. You've always been focused." Not proud, not joyful, just efficient, like I was a project that had met its deadline. Lindsay, meanwhile, stayed close. She married young, 23, in a wedding that our mother planned down to the color of the napkins, and became a suburban housewife almost instantly. Her husband, Mike, was blandly likable, the kind of man who always seemed slightly surprised by his own life, and he treated Lindsay like a trophy he had somehow earned by being agreeable enough. My mother adored him, which made sense, since he never questioned her stories, never pushed back, never asked what Rachel was up to, or why she didn't come around more often. To them, I was independent, which was code for absent, which was code for, we don't need to think about her unless we have to. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't gone. I was watching. I was listening. I was paying attention in the way only someone on the outside can, uninterrupted by the noise of constant validation, unclouded by the illusion of being loved for who you are instead of what you provide. I learned that Lindsay's marriage wasn't as pristine as it looked from the filtered holiday cards and carefully curated social media posts. I noticed the way her smile started looking forced, how she talked faster when Mike was around, how her jokes started sounding more like tests, and I started to collect little things, passing comments, financial habits, inconsistencies in stories. Not because I planned to use them, not at first, but because part of me had stopped trusting anyone to tell the truth. And if I was going to survive this family with my sanity intact, I needed to know what was real. By the time I was 30, I had built a life that from the outside looked quiet and unremarkable. A small condo in a decent neighborhood, a job as a financial advisor that paid the bills, and then some, no kids, no husband, just me and my peace. But underneath that peace was something else, an awareness, a preparation, a readiness that most people mistook for detachment, but was actually the product of years spent waiting for the moment when I could finally stop pretending that I was unaffected by everything they refused to acknowledge. And then, just as I had settled into that rhythm, the cracks in Lindsay's life widened. It started with a panicked call from her late one night, asking if I could help her look over some bank statements because something weird was happening with their joint account. I agreed, not out of kindness, but curiosity. And what I found wasn't just weird, it was a mess. Maxed out credit cards, mysterious withdrawals, a second mortgage she hadn't mentioned. And beneath all of it, a quiet desperation she couldn't name. She had started dipping into her employer's petty cash fund, thinking no one would notice if she paid it back in time. But time, as it turned out, was not on her side. I didn't confront her, I didn't call our mother, I just took notes. I tracked the withdrawals, I gathered statements, I copied emails, I asked polite questions masked as sisterly concern. And when she started confiding in me about the affairs, the drinking, the nights she'd drive around aimlessly to avoid going home, I listened without judgment, not because I forgave her, but because I wanted her to keep talking. It was around then that my mother started to panic. Lindsay's cracks were showing, and for a woman like Diana, whose entire identity was wrapped up in the illusion of a perfect daughter, The idea that Lindsay might actually be fallible was too threatening to acknowledge, so she doubled down. She started inviting me to more family events, suddenly remembering my birthday, asking about my work with a tone of forced warmth. She was trying to hedge her bets, I suppose, trying to reframe the narrative in case Lindsay's world collapsed. But it was too late. I wasn't interested in being the backup daughter. I wasn't interested in their clumsy redemption arc. I had already made my decision. I wouldn't ruin Lindsay publicly. I wouldn't scream or accuse or demand apologies. I would simply present the truth, plain, undeniable, and in her own handwriting. And I would give that truth to the one person who had spent her whole life insisting that I was the one who'd fallen short, the one who didn't love loud enough or laugh hard enough or sparkle in the right way. I didn't need revenge. I needed recognition. And sometimes those two things are closer than people think. So when I sat at that Thanksgiving table, listening to my mother say, with such stunning ease, that Lindsay was the only child who hadn't broken her heart, I didn't flinch because I was hurt. I flinched because it was the moment I realized she still didn't see me. Not as a threat, not as an equal, not even as a daughter who had managed to survive her neglect. She still saw me as the quiet one, the one who didn't need anything. And that was her final mistake, because she had no idea what I had been building and how ready I was to let it all unfold. She held the envelope like it might bite her, her fingers brushing against the edge of the flap, with a hesitation that felt less like caution and more like denial, dressed up in delicacy. And for the first time in years, I saw something in her eyes that resembled fear. Not panic, not guilt, not even remorse, but the kind of fear that only comes when someone finally realizes they've been living in a house built on a foundation of half-truths and selective memory. And now someone is about to turn on the lights. The room had gone quiet, not in the soft way families fall into silence when dessert is being served, but in the sharp, suffocating way people do when something unspeakable is dangling in the air between them, too real to ignore, but too uncomfortable to name. Lindsay's fork hovered midair, still clutched in her hand, as if frozen by the weight of the moment, and Mike, sweet, oblivious Mike, looked from me to the envelope and back again like a man who'd just realized he'd shown up to the wrong movie halfway through. My father, ever the silent enabler, didn't say a word. He reached for the wine bottle instead, pouring another glass like liquid could buffer whatever reckoning was coming. But my mother, Diana, she stared at that envelope as though it were a mirror threatening to show her a reflection she had spent a lifetime avoiding. When she finally opened it, her hands trembled just enough to betray the composure she was trying to maintain, and as she unfolded the documents inside, one page at a time, slowly, almost methodically, I watched her face change. At first, it was confusion, a subtle furrowing of the brow as she scanned the first printed email. Then came the flicker of disbelief, the kind you see when someone is trying to convince themselves that what they're reading must be fake, manipulated, mistaken. But by the third page, an account summary tied to an employee number, a bank transaction record clearly traced back to Lindsay's office, there was no room left for misunderstanding. I had included everything. Copies of internal memos from Lindsay's company outlining discrepancies in petty cash and departmental funds, time-stamped emails showing how she had approved expenses for things that never existed, screenshots of texts from numbers, not saved in her phone, the ones she thought she deleted but had been backed up elsewhere. I had documents showing she had taken out a second mortgage without telling Mike, redirecting funds to cover gambling debts she swore she didn't have, and even records of an apartment lease in her name, in a city 2 hours away, an apartment she never mentioned, an apartment no one else knew about. And then, at the very bottom of the packet, printed on heavier paper, with a gentle weight that somehow made it feel even more cruel, was a letter, written by me not with rage or cruelty, but with clarity. It wasn't accusatory, it was explanatory. I told her how I had watched for years, silently, as she lavished love and attention on Lindsay and treated me like a utility, reliable, efficient, disposable. I wrote about the birthday she forgot when I turned 12, about the time I stayed home sick for 3 days, and she never once came upstairs to check on me, about the day I graduated college and waited in my gown fog outside the ceremony hall for over an hour, thinking maybe she was late, only to find out she never came at all. I reminded her of the things she said when I told her what Lindsay had done with Caleb, and how she brushed it off like it was a teenage misunderstanding, when for me, it was the moment I learned that being hurt wasn't enough to be heard. But most of all, I told her that I didn't want revenge. I didn't need her to suffer. I wasn't looking for an apology I knew would never come. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was for her to know that I had never been blind. I saw everything, I felt everything, and for the first time, I wanted her to feel it too. She didn't say anything for a long time. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like she couldn't quite find the right script. Lindsay, who by now had leaned over to glance at the documents, looked pale, her confidence evaporating in real time as the details unfolded, details too precise to be fabricated, too intimate to be guessed. Mike was staring at her now, not with anger yet, but with the kind of dawning realization that makes a man question everything he thought was solid under his feet. And my father? He still didn't speak, but he had stopped drinking. When my mother finally looked up at me, there was no outburst, no dramatic defense, no tearful plea for forgiveness. Just a long, slow exhale that sounded like the collapse of a myth, like a balloon finally deflating after decades of pretending to be full. She placed the papers down with trembling hands and said my name softly, not like a mother calling a daughter, but like a woman trying to remember who she's been to someone she never really bothered to know. I stood up without another word. I didn't need a confrontation. I had already said everything that mattered on paper, and their reactions, every strained breath, every darting eye, every silence, said more than any screaming match ever could. As I walked out of that dining room, the clink of utensils resumed behind me, a strange, hollow sound that only made the silence louder, and I realized something else. This wasn't a victory. It wasn't triumph. It was just truth. But truth, when it arrives late, has a weight that can't be ignored. I didn't turn around. I didn't look back at Lindsay, who was now gripping her phone like a lifeline, or at my mother, who was still holding the envelope like it might vanish if she blinked too hard. I walked to the front door, opened it, stepped into the cold air, and breathed in a kind of stillness I had never felt before. Not peace, not closure, but certainty. Because the thing about family is, they teach you how to love, but they also teach you how to survive without it. And as I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel like I had broken anyone's heart. I just finally stopped letting them pretend they hadn't broken mine.